Hello and welcome to another transfer live chat, Newcastle United transfer live chat. Lots of things to talk about since I even did the thumbnail last night. I mean, I put Raheem Sterling in the thumbnail, and I wouldn't probably do that again if I was doing that thumbnail today, which says quite a lot about where this situation with Newcastle United and transfers in the last sort of 24 hours has gone. Obviously, other things have happened as well with other clubs, which is going to directly or possibly directly or indirectly link Newcastle United, particularly Fulham's move for Joachim Andersen. Hi, Craig. If you are joining the live, please remember to hit the like button as soon as you join. I really appreciate that support. And I'll keep mentioning that throughout the live as more people join. But before we get going I'll just wait for a few more people to join. But yeah, I think this is as I mentioned at the top, I think this is a sorry, I'm just getting a call. Yeah, getting a phone call. Sorry, just get rid of that. Please don't say we're in for Sterling. I'm still upset about Gomez things. I think the Sterling thing is very, very far fetched. Craig, just to put that out there, I think that was a little bit, as a little bit cheeky from me in terms of clickbait. I mean, it might happen. I mean, Newcastle have been linked in the past, and Newcastle need a winger. He's available. It's a feasible link to make, but I think it's as far as that is concerned. The Gomez thing, I think, is a little bit more different in that sense, but not again something that is the most likely to happen, considering the other centre back situation, which we'll talk about once a few more people join. But yeah, interesting day, and I think I'll start by sort of talking a little bit about the lacking nuance that I'm seeing on social media, which is not a surprise because that's kind of what the whole point of social media is, I guess. But lots of people are sort of falling into one of two camps. I'm seeing either you're panicking about, not you specifically, but people are panicking that nothing's happening in the window and that we're not hearing anything and that moves aren't happening. And some people are saying that there's it's not the end of the world if nobody signs. Now, the way I sort of view it is that both people have there's a middle ground there to have, which is that there's still 9 days left of the window. That's what Newcastle fans should be grappling onto, and the fact that things are going on behind the scenes. And I think lots of people need to not base what they're not hearing as a reason for their concern, because that's exactly what is supposed to happen with Newcastle now. Nothing's supposed to come out. We're supposed to be hit in the it's all supposed to be happening around around other things, and we're not supposed to hear much about it. That's why Guehi being the only thing that we're hearing, and that coming from the Palace side, is quite telling. So there's 9 days left in the window. Work is going on behind the scenes, as we've seen today with the Tapsoba link. That would free up more money for the for a right winger if that were to happen. So things are moving on both counts, and I think what people need to remember is to feel like that it is difficult, and it's not gone to plan. I think nobody would say that they would be getting to this stage of the window without anything happening in terms of major defining first team signings. But at the same time, I think there's a sense that you've got to give them those 9 days. But equally, at the end of the window, if nothing happens, it is a poor window, and it's a missed opportunity. Other teams have strengthened, as we know, and also I think that there's that it to say that nothing's happened. Yes, Newcastle have kept key players, but the point is that if you keep key players, it gives you an opportunity to grow and develop, and they've not taken that opportunity as of yet. I still think there's obviously things going on. A few people in the chat already. Dave says Tapsoba isn't happening. I'll talk about that in a second. Keith Downey, I'm assuming, pretty much ruled out. 4 years in his contract. Key player, Champions League. I wouldn't say zero chance, because I don't think Newcastle would have gone and asked the question if they thought there was zero chance. And crucially, they have had conversations about Tapsoba, both internally and sort of tentatively externally last summer. So perhaps, but I do sort of see that point. Absolutely, I think that there's definitely a sense of something maybe being a little bit doubtful. If you haven't already, do check out my list of potential alternatives. None of the names linked today. Disasi as well as another one who Newcastle looked at last season. Obviously, there's a link with Paul Mitchell and Monaco there as well. So that might be something that could come into play. But I think Chelsea are not likely. I think he's very much in Chelsea. He's not one of those that's not named in Chelsea's plans. If you like Chilwell, Sterling, Chalobah, obviously Gallagher before he left. So there's names that are being put out there for transfers, and Madueke and Madueke and Disasi aren't on those lists. So I'd be interested to see how that one goes. But yeah, I think it's positive that things are moving on. But I also want to say that at the outset of the show, 23 people in. If you haven't already, please do like the video, because it does help. I just want to say that I think that the Guehi deal isn't completely dead as well. Like that, this is a thing that Palace were aware of. Fulham's interest in Joachim Andersen. It makes it difficult. Don't get me wrong, and you know, Steve Parish is on record saying that he's not sure that this would go through without it, that both would go through, and I see why that is obviously the case, but Newcastle and Palace were talking about a deal for Guehi in the full knowledge of Palace being in talks with Fulham for Anderson. So there is obviously the possibility, and there always has been the possibility, that they lose both. They've bid for Lacroix. They've also interested in Kasunu from Leverkusen, which again could definitely impact the Tapsoba thing. So there's lots of moving parts, and I think you're not going to get anything definitive happening in public in the next few days. You might get to a point where Newcastle have an agreement with a player, and then that's where Newcastle need to get to, because they haven't got to yet. So Cloud says, sorry, don't care about right wing, but we need a right centre back who's young and has pace, because the centre backs available are good. The centre backs are available as good as Shah, but the guy is slow. As good as Shah is, sorry, the guy is slow. Yeah, that's what they need. They need a pacey centre back to redefine what it means to be, what Newcastle's defence means, really. I think, because at this stage, they're very good at bringing the ball out of the back, and they're very good at sort of that sort of thing, and classy sort of good defenders. I like what Botman, when he's fit, and obviously Share bring, but they lack pace, and that's where Newcastle were caught out last season. And I think a lot of teams have worked Newcastle out in that sense. So I think that's taken precedence this summer. But I think what the last 24 hours has shown is that there shouldn't be a sense of ruling out the right winger. I think the fact that Sky Sports have said that if Tapsoba were to happen, there would be enough money for a right winger. Quite a few of the names on the list that I put together on the Monday show are the same. Disasi's the same. Chalobah, if they were to go for that, is the same. There's a deal there to be done. Not convinced Chalobah is the player that Newcastle need, but I'm trying to illustrate the point that there are other options out there. And I just want to warn against this sort of thing. Don't just go with the narrative. I think what's quite key is that lots of people have been starved of any information in the last few weeks, because Newcastle don't give it out anymore. They're very quiet in that sense. So the only thing that's been coming out is Palace running the Guehi discussion in public. So the only thing Newcastle fans have had to go on in terms of Newcastle's interest is that they want Guehi. Nothing else has been talked about. Suddenly, Now it's about Tapsoba and it's about Disasi and it's about looking at other options. But that doesn't mean that the Guehi thing is gone, and it doesn't mean that that's not going to happen. Things can happen concurrently. They have been happening concurrently for a long time, and I agree with Sai. I think my choice would be Diamande for the right centre back, and I've explained why. If you haven't checked that out, go and check that out in the comment in the video section. Monday show, I did give a list of about 5 players, and one of those on the list was Antonio Silva, who I think is probably quality wise high up on the list of being the best of that list, but in terms of style, I think style and quality are about as important as each other. Can Lloyd Kelly play right centre back? I mean, I guess he probably can, but I don't think Newcastle are planning for that to happen in reality. So yeah, I just think that there's a lot of people who are jumping to conclusions about where Newcastle's transfer situation is. Again, if they don't bring anybody in the next 9 days, and I think it's fair to say that they've not been it's not been as good as they would have maybe hoped, but in the summer. But I think if they don't bring anyone in the next 9 days, then you ask the questions. But I think they deserve the courtesy of being able to work in those 9 days, and the fact that people are complaining that there's been a lot of unironic complaints that we've not heard anything. While 3 or 4 weeks ago there was complaints that 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 Newcastle when it was completely the opposite, that Newcastle were not doing anything. That's the thing. Like we can't have it both ways. You can't have it that it's too public, the Guehi thing, and it's too public, and therefore it won't happen. But also, a few weeks ago, that there's nothing happening. So, I think you've just got to give them their dues. I think there's obviously a lot of experienced people in that negotiation room, with Paul Mitchell being chief among them. He's got a great track record for recruitment. He deserves he deserves the opportunity in the next 9 days. Then you can ask questions. Absolutely, I'm not denying that, but I do think that Newcastle deserve the next 9 days to make their decisions. And it's not like nothing's happening, despite what we hear, because we don't hear anything anymore because those things don't come out from the Newcastle end. I think it's a positive that there are other names on the list that are now coming out, and Tapsoba is somebody who, again, I can completely understand. I think it was Dave's point earlier about the lack of confidence in Tapsoba coming in because of the Champions League, because of the contract length and that. But wages aren't going to be too high for him. That Bayer Leverkusen are a team that have come from nowhere to win the title. They're a bit like where Newcastle were last season, but on a bigger scale. They're not sort of ready for that level. So clubs like Newcastle, and Premier League clubs can come in and triple their weight, not triple, but they increase their wages quite a lot. So that can be something that can happen. But I think that there's definitely, it's good news at the very least that things are coming, that things are moving, and it means that things can also move on the right winger situation. A few people have asked me in these lives, by the way, do I think anything can happen out of the blue? I think more likely that, because there's the options of players who Newcastle have been linked with in public, if you like, and common knowledge who Newcastle have liked in the right wing situation, likes of Mbeumo, who somebody mentioned that they want to come in this summer, the likes of obviously Neto before he went to Chelsea, Mazueke. There's the availability of those players, as I've mentioned, is not quite as obvious as it is for some of these right wing, some of these defenders. So I think that if there's a player that comes in that nobody's expecting, it'll probably be on that right hand side. And Mbeumo is difficult to do because they're not. I highly doubt that I highly doubt that Brentford are going to be willing to listen to offers for him and Tony, and they've seemed to have, they've done it. Something I didn't mention on a very different live the other week was about evening Jay, how are you doing? the other thing I didn't mention was that Palace and Brentford have gone for very different approaches to their sellable assets. Like, I think Brentford have jumped the gun and not played Tony out of the fact that there's interest and there's a possibility of a deal being struck with a team from Saudi Arabia that I think by the sounds of it are only up to about half of what Brentford's asking price is. But they didn't play him against Palace, whereas Guehi played in that game, even though Newcastle are reportedly just a few million pounds away from the valuation. So it's a different way of things. I think Tapsoba would be a massive coup. I agree, but I do sort of see what Dave means as well. Sai says, if Newcastle to only make one signing in the window, do you think it would be a right wing or a right centre back? At this stage, it'll be a centre back. I think just in terms of numbers, in terms of I think if you look at the squad when everyone's fit, you could make a case, and I think lots of people have, that the right wing is the most pressing thing. It's the one position, and I do appreciate someone said in a previous live that the right centre back hadn't also been upgraded. But in terms of winger options, you've got Almiron as a player there. You've got Murphy. I'm not saying that they're good options to have at this level, but they are numerically they are options. Then you bring in possibly Gordon out there. You could play Barnes out there. There are different things you can do. Whereas just purely in terms of numbers, Newcastle are already short in defence, and I think that's become the most pertinent thing. But also look at it purely statistically. They conceded the third most amount of goals from last season, and they scored more than they ever have in the Premier League season. So that shows you where the actual needs of the team may lie at this stage, even though on paper, when everyone's fit, a centre back pairing of Schär and Botman is good enough to play in at a high level in the Premier League, whereas Almiron or Murphy might not be good enough to play out the right. But the very point is that Schär's banned for 3 games and Botman isn't fit till January. So there's a desperate need at this point for a centre back. Please do continue to like the live stream if you're here and get in the comments, and subscribe if you haven't already. Up to 632 subscribers, which is brilliant. But yeah, please do continue to help me grow the channel. And these live streams are proving a very good way of doing that. People saying Botman coming back, Lascelles coming back, but they're not really coming back, are they? I guess. What's to say they'll come back as the same players after ACL injuries, says Clouds. It's going to take them a while to get back to form. But I mean, even if they do come back to their best, it's not till January. You can't plan for that. So I agree with that. Antonia says goals were not an issue last season. We never had anyone fancier than Murphy. Yeah, I think that's the point. I think that's a very valid point for where Newcastle are. But at this point, I think also it's worth mentioning that there are options out there, and I think that's become clear. And there are options out there who can give enough money to go and find another right winger who's maybe ready to make that step up. And I think what I wouldn't be surprised to see is maybe a big name centre half in terms of whether it's Diamonde, whether it's Tapsoba, whether it's Disasi Bastoni, who's Jay just mentioned in the chat as well. Whether it's someone like that, and then they go and find a sort of not an Asula level player, but a player who could play on the right hand side, who's got promise but not quite there to sort of mold and grow into that role, who might cost a little bit less. But yeah, there's if you look at Jorginho Ruta going to Brighton for 40 million, that was his release clause. I think he would have come in and looked like a good signing for Newcastle this summer. In my opinion, after sort of acclimatizing to the Championship, he had a high ceiling when he joined Leeds from Hoffenheim, and then obviously struggled in a poor team. Did well last season. I think he'll be a great signing for Brighton. But 40 million quid, that's Newcastle can more or less afford to sign two players at that value if they really need to this summer, and that's why I think it's a bit curious that they've pushed so hard for Guehi in that sense, because that would have left them with very little wiggle room. But I think, yeah, there's more surprise. There could be a surprise or two up the sleeve with up their sleeve with the right wing side of things. Who's been Dave just asked who's been my signing of the summer. Honestly, it's difficult to really say. It look by the looks of things, it could be Yankuba Minter. The way he started preseason, the way he played in that game, and I hate to say it, but like you know, uh, what was interesting was lots of people at the start of the summer we were sort of saying Newcastle were looking at uh, Minter being the understudy to a right midfielder, another right midfielder coming in this summer, whereas Minter now looks like on the basis of his preseason, yes, it's a small sample size. I completely agree with that, and I completely take that in. But if Newcastle started with had Minter in their squad, you would absolutely. I think the context of Newcastle having Yankuba Minter now would mean there wouldn't be a conversation about right midfield because Minter would start and and the centre back would be the bigger thing. Whereas at the start of the summer, it was like the idea that Minter would come in and be you'd either go back out on loan or he'd come in and he'd be a squad player. And the fact that he's started so well at Brighton shows that, yeah, I think that's good. He looks like a brilliant signing for Brighton. I'll think about some other possibilities at the moment because I think actually there's been a lack of quality signings. Like I think Manchester United have made a few really really good additions on top of actually last summer when they made a few good additions as well. I think Højlund's going to eventually be a really good player. Yoro's a really talented defender, but again, and Xerxes is a good player. But again, the price points and is it what they actually need? I think there's actually been quite a lack of obvious signings from a lot of clubs this summer where you look at it and think that's exactly what they need. And that's a really, really good signing. I think there's actually quite a lack of those. There's not actually been. I was thinking about this. There's not actually been that many big name signings that have come from like different places in the way that like Haaland did or Casemiro did, or not talking in terms of how successful they've been. But Calafiori is going to be a good one as well. I'm just riffing, by the way. Here I am just sort of like rambling a little bit. But yeah, I think there's been a lack of quality additions across the board this summer. Looking at West Ham, I think I like the look at Guido Rodriguez as a signing. I like the look at Todibo. Looks like a signing Newcastle could have made, but I'm questioning. What's the point in signing Somerville and Kilman for 80 million and Fulkrug for 30 when he's 31? He's not going to get any better. Like there's lots of that sort of thing that's going on at pretty much every club, I think, at this stage, which is why I'm sort of less panicky about where Newcastle are going with their window. I still think caveat that with the fact that they do need to sign somebody. Demetrius is asking, what's the process that goes on between teams as they approach each other to buy and sell players? What's the realistic minimum timescale to get a deal done? I think it's difficult to know an exact science with this, but I do want to say, and I think I've said this previously on other podcasts, that I think people do sort of misunderstand how deals are done, and it is kind of like a bit like these conversations, like they're not official. Like you saw, like I'll give you an example. Luke Edwards, I think, came out and said that Newcastle were quite surprised that the last bid had been rejected because they weren't actually outwardly told that. And I think this is kind of the way it is. It's not a case of like it may be used to, or like maybe people view it through like the guise of like playing Football Manager or FIFA, where you literally put a bid in place, you wait for the response comes, and then you react to that. I think it's more a fluid conversation. So the fact that and this is why I think Newcastle are still at the table for Guehi, because we've got to this point and everybody, as far as everyone's concerned so far, is still at the table and still willing to make a deal happen, because I think that it isn't that far away. So the process is less about how it looks in terms of formal bids. I think it's less about that. It's more, lots of it's done on WhatsApp. Lots of these chats are done on Zoom calls. meetings face to face where they are sort of like, let's talk about a ballpark, and they wouldn't get to those stages if there was absolutely no hope. Now Newcastle, I think, as I've said on my video on Monday, I think this is a point where Newcastle are publicly, maybe it's in the public interest, in their interest, maybe, sorry, to make it public that they're chasing another defender, because then it puts Palace under pressure. Because at the moment, Palace are confident enough to say that Newcastle are still at the table, so they can maybe go a bit public and try and draw up other interest and get as much as they can out of Guehi, knowing that Newcastle won't get frustrated. Whereas if Newcastle get something sorted for another defender, then they can turn around and say, look, we've got this deal sort of agreed we've got this deal agreed. Let's, in principle, let's it's up to you, and take back control. So the process is very fluid, I would say, to answer that question. And I think minimum timescale, I think Newcastle will have been surprised, like everyone's been surprised by Palace's actions with Guehi, because usually a club in that situation where they've got such a weak hand in terms of the player's not going to sign a new contract, he's got 2 years left in his deal, this is the last summer to make optimum value out of that deal, they would just sell for what they could get, which is around, and I think lots of people would say 60 million is at the very least what he's worth. It's certainly not, that's certainly not cheap, is it? Like, I think we can say that. Like, I think so. It's rare that a club would look at that and say that, we'll try and push it further. Now, Palace have played a very risky game, but their position's weak. Like, if they don't sell him this summer, they'll be lucky to get half of what Newcastle have offered next year. And the fact that he is not signing a new contract gives them absolutely no leverage, which is very, very rare. So I think so to link this point to what Demetrius is asking about timescales, I think Newcastle will have gone in there expecting this to be done in a couple of weeks, because they will have expected to meet a club that's in a weak that is acknowledging their weak position. Whereas Palace, which is completely up to them, they must understand what the risks of this are and what the consequences of this could be, but they are sort of acting like he's got 3 years left in his contract or 4 years left in his contract, which, as was mentioned by, I think it was Dave, said earlier, like, that's exactly what you expect from someone like Leverkusen, who are in a position of power with Champions League football. This is the sort of, Crystal Palace are acting a little bit like that, which is quite surprising. And I think the fact that names are coming out now means that I think Newcastle have got to a point where they know that they need a little bit of the narrative to change in their direction, because they're kind of getting played off the park in terms of their desire to get Guehi at the moment. Nathan says, genuinely don't know why we don't move on from Guehi. If the report from Sky is correct, we would get either Leverkusen centre back for less and Guehi's and enough for a right midfielder. Yeah, see, I think again, it can happen concurrently. Like, you can get these deals lined up and you can talk, and you don't have to leave the table for Guehi. But I do think that I agree with the premise of that there's enough money surely to go and get some sort of upgrade in two positions. So I do agree with that generally. I think the price is just mental. I'm assuming this is for Guehi from Jay. A bit more than 35 before the Euros, and buying players after good showings at international tournaments is risky. Crazy to pay double his pre-Euro value. I guess, but I mean that's subjective, isn't it? In terms of what his pre-Euro value is, I think he has been. I agree with and appreciate the sentiment that his value has gone up because of the Euros, and that in itself is risky. But I also think that, unlike Tapsoba but unlike any of the names that I mentioned on the list on Monday, like, the thing that Guehi has over all of those is that you can pretty much guarantee that he comes in. You can guarantee that he comes in and makes a difference immediately. Whereas other players, there's a bit more of a risk of adapting to the league, especially with it being later in the window. But the benefit of it being later in the window is that clubs are going to become a little bit more, maybe that facade of Palace that Palace are playing with now might fade when it comes to later in the window and no one else is talking. Like I said on my video, it's interesting that that Parish is sort of talking about there's other clubs at the table. Yeah, he's openly admitting that Newcastle are one of them, and openly like name checking Paul Mitchell, for example. But he doesn't name any other clubs. I think that kind of shows everything you need to know about that. If you haven't already, please, 56 people in the live, that's amazing. If you haven't already, please do like the live stream and subscribe to the channel to help grow. But yeah, I think we're at a position with Guehi where there's actually a lot of. I think if you actually analyze how these things are working, it's not surprising that Palace are playing the game they are, but it's also not surprising that Newcastle are still at the table because I think they believe that eventually that if they wait it out, they'll get him. It's that's a different question to whether it's worth it when you could go and spend on different players. Demetrius says we haven't had much discussion comparing Newcastle to Man City cost in terms of cost of centre backs. City have at least 3 players costing over 50 million. Yeah, I think that's what. Who are those centre backs though? I mean, it was Laporte, which I think was a release clause. I might be wrong because I do know that the Athletic Club are very, very insistent on that sort of paying the release clause as a minimum sort of thing for Laporte. It was Stones who was, kind of where Palace will argue Guehi is in terms of being England's best centre back and particularly strong in terms of what Guardiola wanted. And there was another one that I think you're probably talking about, Walker, who you could probably argue is the same in terms of a centre back, a fullback, sorry, who comes in and instantly does that. I think again, there's lots of contact. There's lots of context in terms of that, but again, yeah, it's a very fair point. Craig says Parish priced Zaha out of a move, and look how that ended. Yeah, I was thinking about Zaha the other day. It seems a little bit of a from his perspective or whatever. He spends so long not wanting to rock the boat because he loves Palace, but wanting to leave to play in the Champions League, and then has a year where he does okay at Galatasaray, and then he's linked with the Premier League return either to Palace or to Leicester, and it sort of shows that maybe he's missed. Marc says, have you heard anything about Trippier? There's rumours going around that giving the captaincy to Bruno does seem a little bit strange that if he's not going. Yeah, I think again there's a very distinct possibility that this could happen. I wouldn't jump to conclusions on his playing for Sunderland against Sunderland in midweek. I mean, maybe it does mean something in that regard, but I would suggest that that's just building fitness up because he's only had a couple of weeks back from the Euros. And at his age, maybe he needs to build that up. But but equally, you could, somebody could jump in the comments here and say that they think it means something. I couldn't really argue with them because there is a lot of strange noises around Trippier at the moment, I think, and Saudi Arabia's interest is still there. The fact that he's lost the captaincy is quite telling, and I think it is probably it is very possible that he could go before the end of the window. Just think it would be far better spent elsewhere, says Jay. Eddie's bias to PL proven hurt us last summer, not buying Champions League experienced players from abroad. Bruno was ESAT with Nixon recommendations. Well, Howe says that Howe, I think, has gone public and said that ESAT was his, but Bruno certainly was more on the Nixon side, I think. But yeah, again, I understand the sentiment of that about Premier League proven. There are, when you look at the markets out in Europe compared to what they are in the UK, like someone like Coop Miners, for example, I think he has signed or he's going to sign for Juve for about 50 million euros, and he helped Atalanta win the Europa League last summer. Can you imagine if he was English, what he'd cost, or what it would cost if he played in the Premier League? I think I would, in these sort of big upgrade things. I think Newcastle have been, I think as has been said that that Newcastle have done better when it in terms of upgrading, making solid upgrades to the team. Maybe Gordon aside, but even when Gordon signed, there was a lot of people debating this. I think Newcastle have actually done, in terms of Botman, Bruno, and Isak, they've actually their strongest upgrades have come from Europe. and with the exception of Isak in that case, I think they got two out of those three players for less than what they showed themselves worth to be. I mean, to get Botman, who was incredibly highly rated and had just won the French title the year before he joined, as in like he had a season where they didn't win it. Yeah, I think that there's definitely evidence of the strongest upgrades coming from Europe, and I do think personally, I think they've missed a trick by not looking at that list of brilliant centre halves earlier. I mean, they have looked at that. They drew up that list and it had Todibo on it last summer. It had Tapsoba on it last summer and Antonio Silva on it, but they haven't acted on that list. They've gone for Tosin, then they've gone for Guehi, and I understand exactly what Craig's saying about Tonali having Premier League experience, not being PL proven and having not having Premier League experience, but I think I think that he was supposed to be the big signing from last summer, and as I say, he in an ideal world he would have, had he not had the ban, he'd be looking as another proven player, which would prove the point I'm trying to make, which is most of the biggest upgrades have come from Europe. John Lane is in the chat saying from Northeast Divide podcast, saying it's a great show and to give him a plug. So I will give him a plug. John joins me on True Faith quite often, and I was on his show to preview the Premier League season for talking about Newcastle United. It's a show that combines a Newcastle perspective with a Sunderland perspective. So if that's your bag, go and check that out. He's got some good shows. He's had some decent guests on it, so it's a good show. I would go and suggest that you go and look at that if you haven't already. Yeah, so there you go, John. I've given you plug. But yeah, I think generally, the best upgrades have come from Europe, and I'm surprised that they've looked so heavily at upgrading in centre back. The two players that they've really gone for in centre back have been Premier League proven in Premier League come for the Premier League. Sorry, in Tosin and now Guehi. Craig says Mitchell coming in and Amanda Medad leaving will have thrown a spanner in our transfer business, which is why I'm chilled about it. We have to spend wisely, so taking our time is sensible. Yeah, I think that is generally the point, but I also think at this point, I think they probably would have and should be wanting a little bit more. People who, this is what I'm trying to say about nuance and about difference of the difference of the two camps that are emerging on Twitter. Like, it's absolutely fair to say that's a very good point, by the way, that Mitchell coming in will have postponed things a little bit and changed there will have been a bedding in period that will have happened at the start of July, which is when the window's already open. That's not ideal, but at the same time, not having any major player in by this point in the window is not ideal. So I think the people who say that they're chilled about it, I think it's not really. I mean, would you be chilled in 10 days when if they don't have a player in? But at the same time, they deserve that every little bit of the market to get to the point where they can make a decision on a player, because otherwise, I think that I'm seeing lots of people saying that it's been a failure of a window already. Well, if in 9 days Newcastle have a right midfielder who's viewed as an upgrade to what they've got, and a centre back who's viewed as an upgrade to what they've got, I think that's a successful window. Whether and ultimately when they get the players in won't really matter. But I do take that view as an absolutely very fair point from Craig. That I do take that point from Craig that Medad and Amanda leaving has changed the dynamic, which I mentioned in my BBC article as well. Yeah, I'd rather keep that Craig then come back and said I'd rather keep the powder dry and overpay on the wrong player. But but again, I would caveat that by saying that the right players are out there and they're not actively looking for them. Like the list of players that I think, this is just my opinion, and lots of people seem to share it in the chat and generally on Twitter as well, and in the fan base. Like, I think it to me it doesn't seem that hard to at least get one player in when you've got 70 million to at least get one player who makes massive difference to this team. And I do sort of subscribe to the idea that and I'm not saying that they haven't done anything, but going so hard and being willing to pay so much for Guehi when the upshot of that means that not improving the right wing is probably a bad idea when there are so many good options. The fact that Sky have come out and said that Tapsoba, who's a proven Champions League player, who's going to be playing in the Champions League next season if he's not going to leave, he's won the Bundesliga, he's had a great season, and it's easy to say that the fact that Sky have said that him coming in means that there's money left over shows, I think, that they probably have gone a little bit too deep for Guehi. But again, like, don't be fooled by the fact that the narrative has all been about Guehi for 3 weeks and they've got nothing. That doesn't mean that nothing else has been happening in the past. And now also, on the flip side, the fact that now Tapsoba is the name in vogue, that doesn't mean that Guehi's gone as well. Yeah, precisely. Exactly, Dave. Both things can be true at the same time. Failure, and it's a failure if they don't sign anyone and there's still time. Exactly. So long. If you stay still on X and lose your shit, will seems to be happening at the moment. Exactly. I think that's ultimately the point. John from Northeast Devices. It's really easy for Newcastle fans to think we're only trying to sign one centre back at the time and not even looking at the right wing. Must be more nuanced than that. Exactly. I think that's the point. For me, it's the message that I'm getting from that we got from the very start of the summer is that once Amanda's and Mehrdad left, the focus shifted to not leaking anything, and every single rumor that's actually turned out to be anything this summer, be it tossing, but particularly even since then, actually Asula and Guehi being the main two, they've all come from outside and then been clarified by Newcastle, and I think that says quite a lot. So don't worry just because there's no noise, because it doesn't mean anything's things aren't happening, if that makes sense. Yeah. So since Raheem Sterling's name since Raheem Sterling's name is in the headline, and since Raheem Sterling is in the thumbnail, and by the way, as I said at the start, I wouldn't have put him in the thumbnail if I was doing that thumbnail today. It's interesting though with Maresca. I mean, what do you guys make of Maresca's very bold press conference today? If you haven't seen it already, he's been very frank and very honest, and said that he's told the likes of Chalobah and Gallagher before he left, and Raheem Sterling and a couple of others, Chilwell, that they are not going to get minutes. And he says that isn't bold, that isn't brash, that isn't brutal, that's just fair and honest. And I think I tend to agree with him. By the sounds of it, it seems a little bit colder than that with players being forced to train away. But Sterling looks like he's going to be leaving. If a deal could be done where Newcastle didn't have to pay that amount of wage, because I think the biggest problem with Chelsea at the moment is actually lots of people saying, and I agree with this, it looks like they don't have a lot of a plan, but actually I think their plan is to go after the players. They've made mistakes in terms of big contracts, and their plan is to go after players like Sterling, who they've paid £350,000 a week for. The plan is to get those players out, give longer contracts with players who have less wages. Like, for example, Madueke is on 50 grand a week, but he's got a 6-year contract. So that's their plan. So if you have a big contract, you're kind of in trouble, which is what Chilwell will have, which is what Sterling has as well. But if a deal could be done, I know somebody said earlier on that they didn't want Sterling, but if a deal could be done, would you take Sterling if on loan or for the season or whatever to sort of see how this goes? Someone's already come back. Jay's already come back and said, God knows his best days are behind him. How do you take training with 47 players? So yeah, actually answered this. Maresca answered this and said, I'm not training with 47 players. 25 of them are not in the squad. They're with the reserves. And that's what I mean about the unhealthy nature of this. And somebody pointed out on Sky, I think earlier, I think it was Gary Cottrell who was reporting from there, said that that's fine. if you're bold and brash in the summer and you're coming in and saying that, but if you're not winning games, then and you're isolating senior players, then that's not a good look, and you might have some trouble with that. 2 games 11 aside, Demetrius says. Yeah, I think again, by the way, if you haven't liked the stream, please do continue to do so to help it grow. And if you haven't subscribed as well, do so, please. John says, I'd say he's lost the dressing room, but I think lots of the lads who can't fit into the dressing room. Interesting what impacts it could have on the ones who was in favour. As I say, I think it comes down to results. I think if Chelsea don't win any games at the start of the season, then this very strong hand that he's come in with can be weakened significantly. Whereas if he's winning games, then no one can really say anything. But I think it's fair. What is fair is that this idea that he's been criticised for the way he is treating players who he's not going to talk to. If he's telling them in advance, then I don't know what else they can expect. Like the worst thing would be to, I think, and speaking to a lot of former players when they've been in this situation, lots of players say that they don't like liars. They don't care what the answer is as long as he's honest. Now, if Maresca has told Sterling and told whoever else that this is how it is, then I guess that's ultimately what can be. That's ultimately what people. What else can you expect? Craig says, is Maresca just doing as he's told? Enzo is bang average, but he's captain, undroppable. What's that all about? I don't. By the sounds of it, he's not doing what he's told because he's. I think from a club's perspective, I'd imagine that they'd not be particularly happy with a few of the decisions he's making in terms, namely maybe Sterling, if isolating him to the point where if they can't get rid of him, then he's big and he's on big wages and he's sat in the thing and he's sort of cutting all ties. I think that's a risky strategy. It sounds like he's not doing what he's told, but at the same time, I just think that Chelsea have generally signed a lot of players, a lot of good players for the prices of great players. So Enzo Fernandez is a good player. I think lots of Premier League clubs would have him, but that they paid 120 million or whatever it was for him, that kind of means that he becomes undroppable because that you can't. For what I just alluded to with Sterling, you can't have too many players on big money that you're not using, so you have to try and get the most out of them. And they've made mistakes. I would say that Fernandez is one of the better players that have signed, in my opinion, but not for the price. But in terms of the price they signed him for, absolutely not. And that's kind of what the problem's been. They've spent so much money, Chelsea, on they should on their squad that they should be the best team in the world, and they're absolutely nowhere near that. They're not guaranteed. They're no one's guaranteed for even getting into the top 4, which is just ridiculous when you talk about what they've spent. But let's talk a bit more about Newcastle, as I say. The others want Sterling gone. Yeah, it's a fair point. Yeah, I agree with that, Jay. I think that's a very fair point as well about his controversy making him captain. It doesn't look good, does it? But yeah, let's talk a bit more about Newcastle. What are your thoughts on the centre back situation of the names linked? So look at the players that I linked. The one we haven't actually talked a lot about is Joe Gomez. And I know somebody said they didn't want him. I made it clear in my video he's not the player for me because I think he's not proven that he can. He's only ever really been a squad player at Liverpool, and 45 million. Yes, he's played for England, but 45 million for a squad player is a lot of money that he just isn't worth, especially when he's 27. The reason why he would work, I think, is because he can play across the back line. But when you compare him to someone like Diamonde or Tapsoba or anyone else that was on that list, or even Disasi, like Disasi's another one. We'll talk about him in a second. But I think that that it's interesting to see what happens with Gomez but for me, I think uh, he's not worth it. So let me know what you think in the comments. By the way, if I sort of tail off halfway between a sentence, it's because I start reading what you're saying, and the chat goes really far ahead of me, so I lose my train of thought. So that's so apologies on that. What's the general derision towards Disasi? Says Luke. I think he's a good player. I think I've said this on numerous occasions. Lots of those players that Chelsea have in their squad, and I think the case in point with this is Kai Havertz. Lots of those players you would sign who would sign for another player for another club and become better players because they're able to thrive in situations which Newcastle patently Newcastle patently aren't. Newcastle patently aren't in a position to look at doing that. So I think that Disasi is a player that's got a lot of quality, and I think that that if Chelsea were to sell a lot of these players, they'd go to better clubs and go to better teams and do better things. But at Chelsea, he's just not able to thrive, and he's struggled in a team that struggled defensively, particularly. And I would say that he's a player that falls into that category. So I think he'd definitely improve Newcastle's team. Marc says Joe Gomez is 27 years old. Wrong price, bad injury record, which is a point that somebody that I haven't made, which is very fair. Hasn't played more than 22 games in a season, and if we buy him, we'd actually strengthen one of our rivals, which is a very fair point. Craig says I don't think we should be buying players from teams around us, Liverpool, Man United, and Chelsea. We're looking to challenge them, taking their rejects doesn't help us gain ground. I think I would agree in principle with that. Sorry about that noise. I would agree in principle with that, but I think Chelsea are slightly different in that because they've accrued so many players that have got high reputations, as I alluded to in my very messy answer to the last question. I would say that that Chelsea are like they do have a lot of they've just bought lots of players with lots of potential and sort of just stuck them in the squad and not giving them a chance to grow. So like when Newcastle were linked with Disasi and Badiashile in previous windows, and they targeted them both, and I think they would have come in and done good jobs for Newcastle and grown under Eddie Howe, and I think that's the case now for Disasi, for Madueke. That's why I've championed those players. But generally, I think it's a fair point with like Liverpool who don't have that depth of squad. I think the difference with Chelsea is that obviously those players could be available for decent prices, that as well below what they would have been worth if they'd stayed at their previous clubs. Whereas, Gomez is just a player that's not going to be any better or worse whether he leaves or stays at Chelsea. Dimitri says at this point it's lower risk to not spend the money and pay on the wrong player. I think that's always the thing. Would if that was always the question, that if that was always the choice, you would always say don't spend the money. But as I said earlier, I think there's plenty of the right players out there for money that Newcastle can afford. So I would argue that I would slightly disagree with that. What are the scouts doing most of the time? That again, like I think lots of people think that the scouts are doing nothing and that nothing's happening because people aren't hearing about it. But principally, that there's lots of players at Newcastle. As I've just said in the previous answer, like they're interested in Disasi, which is and Badiashile, which will be increased by the fact that both of those players came through at Monaco. So they're probably back on the radar in terms of Paul Mitchell. But they were interested in Newcastle way before he came in. Before at the very start of the takeover, I don't know if you remember that January when Newcastle were linked with Botman and linked with Diego Carlos. They were also linked with Badiashile. And then 6 months later, when Botman went, or maybe a year, 18 months later, I can't remember when Badiashile moved to Chelsea. But he moved to Chelsea and then just became he just became another player. And I think it's really important to remember with these players that they need room to grow that they would get at Newcastle that they're not getting at Chelsea. So there's lots of players that Newcastle are interested in and monitoring that I think I don't think there's much fresh scouting going on this summer because they, as I've previously said in a different video, in a different live stream, like there's only a small amount of players, which Eddie Howe's actually alluded to, that will improve the team. So they're probably aware of all these players anyway. By promising young players without horrific injury records, says Jay, let Eddie develop them, profit. I assume you develop them or get profit from them in terms of transfers. We need to do a bit more of Chelsea-style stockpiling. Yeah, I mean, I agree with the first point. I think the stockpiling thing is the answer because I think that's why they're struggling because they're not developed. So they've bought good players who with potential who just stay as good players with potential because they don't get the minutes. And the fact that there's like 35 signings and 45 players that they've got, I think is a thing. Craig says, "Don't forget the no dickhead policy. There may be players, good players, but they may be." I'm not going to repeat that word, even though I shouldn't have actually repeated the word dickhead. But yeah, that is true. But I don't think Newcastle are getting to the point with those players. I think in terms of, I think with Badiashile and Disasi, for example, they wanted those two players for a long time. And also, by the way, Disasi can also play right back. He's played right back at times. Chelsea, he's played right back at times. Youth player for Monaco as well. So that would also, if Disasi comes in, then there's also slight cover for Trippier as well if he goes out and doesn't get replaced. Because if Trippier goes out, there's no chance that Newcastle replace him. So there's a number that so in terms, someone asked about Trippier earlier. If he leaves, Newcastle don't replace him. So someone like Disasi, who's quick and sort of good at recovery and that sort of thing, and versatile, makes a lot of sense. Disasi isn't great on the ball, says Craig. But would you say, Craig? This is a question I'm throwing out there, not putting my opinion on it. But would you say that Eddie Howe could improve that in him? Do you see enough in Disasi to improve that Eddie Howe could improve on him? Harrison Ashby, I think it looks like he's either going to go out on loan or get sold. I'm not sure that he has developed enough at this stage. Again, sort of like I don't think anyone had. I think he was bought for £3 million, so there were not many people who had too much expectation. But he was bought at the same time as Gordon, and Gordon's obviously become a key player, and there's absolutely no sign of that from Harrison. I think 18 months where he struggled at Swansea on loan last season as well. I think there's not too much hope from him at this stage. So I wouldn't be surprised if he goes either as a player that's sold or more likely on loan again. But I don't think there's too much hope for him going forward at the moment. Still plenty of people in the chat. Let me know. Please do continue to like the stream as well. Still plenty of people in the chat. Let's continue for a little bit. But I do have to wrap it up fairly soon. It feels like so. Dimitri says, "How do you know that the character personality work if you're scribbling for deals at the arse end of the transfer window?" I think that you'll have got. I'm assuming it again with the case of these players because Tapsoba, because Disasi, and because I think I've just brought Badiashile as an example in, but because of those two who've been named today have been on the list from previous windows, I would imagine that they've already got character references for them. So I don't think that there'd be too many issues in that sense. Is it fair to judge Paul Mitchell on this window? I think it says Northeast Divide / John. I think to answer that is again it's nuanced, isn't it? Like what does judging mean in terms of like does he deserve another window? Then yes, he deserves another window, but he also deserve a bit of criticism, I think, for not bringing in players because, as I've said, there's plenty of quality out there that Newcastle have previously scouted. Like, there's not really an excuse. Like, there's not really an excuse when Newcastle have been linked with all these players. I've mentioned Disasi, um, I've mentioned Antonio Silva before. I've mentioned Tapsoba before. Lots of these players have been linked for a long time. They're on Newcastle's radar. Paul Mitchell shouldn't really be coming in and change it. He should just be looking at that list. And as I said, the list is as I said, Eddie Howe said as well. The list of players who can impact Newcastle is small. So he deserves criticism if he doesn't sign anybody, but he doesn't deserve. I think he can. It's a bad start rather than anything else. I think he can absolutely recover. Yeah, that's a good point Craig's made, that Chalobah's lost his squad number to Felix, and Sterling's lost his to Neto as well. Jay says, I think Eddie repeatedly saying it must be the right player means he's battered back on a raft of suggested signings. Possibly, I'm not sure. Is it right if Piff have some sort of involvement in Chelsea? If so, it would make sense that billions are getting spent on them and we're getting Chelsea dregs. I think there's a thing of there's like business connections between Saudi Arabia. Again, I don't really know this off the top of my head. So there is some talk that Clear Lake have some sort of connection, but it's not Piff have. It's not like that Piff have got direct involvement in Chelsea. I think they've got involvement with Clear Lake, which is slightly different, I think. But again, I'm not sure on that, to be honest. But I think I assume what Marc's also pointing towards is the fact that like the likes of Koulibaly and others and Mendy and a few other players went to Saudi Arabia last season. Again, they were available players who have got high reputations, particularly in willing to go to Saudi Arabia at that point. Is not not everybody was like if you haven't seen, Lukaku was asked about going to Saudi Arabia at the start of last summer and said no, and then by the end he said he would have done it because other players had gone. So at the point that they were signing Koulibaly and Mendy, they were very obvious, and like Fabinho as well. They were all players who were coming towards the end of their sort of peak years, and it was time for them to move. So not many clubs in the Premier League and across Europe have many of those. Chelsea are one of them. Liverpool were another as well. So I don't think there's anything suspicious about Chelsea and Saudi Arabia or anything like that. How do you balance the risk of non-UK players getting homesick 10 minutes after a transfer? Well, all of these things. Look, it's very simplistic to say this, but I would say that if you want to look at it simplistically, you've got on the one hand, you've got the perceived you've got the perceived idea that a player from the UK is safe because they've played in the Premier League. They're not leaving the country. They're settled in the country. They're settled with the style of play and all that sort of thing. So but for that perceived, you have to pay a premium for that perceived safety net. So that's why Palace are after so much for Guehi, because not only is he English, but he's also played so well for England. But also he's young. He's going to still get better, and he's played in the Premier League. That's what you're paying the premium for. You don't play as much in Europe, but the risk of that comes with lack of security of knowing that they're definitely going to be happy in England, that they can definitely adjust to playing the right style of play and all that sort of thing. But again, my answer to that generally, specifically with Newcastle, would be that they've shown that signing players from Europe has worked. Isak, Bruno, Tonali is a bit out there, but by all the sounds of it, in terms of settling off the pitch, there's not been any issues with that. And Botman, they've all come in and done really well. There's not been a bad signing out of that lot from Newcastle's perspective. So that's why you're absolutely right to point out that there is an issue with the there is an issue with the difference and why. But I think you've proven why clubs in England tend to pay more tend to demand more for their players, because there's the perceived idea that they're just ready to adjust, whereas that, Newcastle have actually had, with 3 players, as I've mentioned, quick adjustments, no issues at all, and they've just settled in. So I think there's enough evidence there for Newcastle's perspective to say that they can go for European players quite easily. Yeah. Any more thoughts? Keep going down in the chat. And just as a reminder, if you haven't checked already, do check out my channel update. This is the last live from Transfer Live before the end of the window, because I'm going away on Friday for a couple of weeks. So I won't be around to do any videos, but once I'm back, there'll be lots of live content after matches and previews that'll be pre-recorded, lots of other things as well. So do check out the video if you haven't already. But yeah, keep giving your thoughts. I'll keep the live going for a few more minutes. But yeah, it feels like. Thank you very much, John. Cheers. Jay says Brighton do it right. Premier League proven, older, experienced players on the cheap, and everything else is just pure speculation on FM Wonder Kids. It's a very simplistic viewpoint, but yes, I sort of tend to agree. But lots of people, this summer particularly, I've just written an article on this very topic, I think, with Fabian Herzler coming in as this young coach. Lots of people sort of looking at people like Minter and looking at a couple of the players that they bought from Denmark, and lots of, as you say, risky players from abroad. Lots of people think that this year might be the year that Brighton struggle because they're not. There's not enough familiarity. I slightly disagree with that. I think we're aware of how good Minter looks, and also, as I said earlier, I think Ruto is going to be a really good signing. But principally, you're absolutely right. They do have a good balance between that sort of core of the squad, and then bringing in the idea of risking with other players. And I think Newcastle have that core of the squad now. I think Newcastle have a good core of the squad. Like I said, even if Trippier goes, Bruno's coming in as captain anyway, and he's sort of settled, and he's an example of how players from Europe can adjust. I think Byrne and the likes of him and Longstaff and Wilson as well, Pope. There's a strong core of players there, so Newcastle do have enough strength in their squad to go and maybe take a couple of risks in terms of the players that they go and get this summer. But again, if you'd asked me even at the time of signing Bruno, Botman and Isak, particularly Botman and Isak when they joined in the summer, is this a risk? I would have said absolutely not, because they're good enough. And I understand the idea of Premier League proven, but I don't think it should be a be all and end all, and it certainly shouldn't be a reason to pay 10, 15 million pounds, maybe more than you would for a player if they weren't, in inverted commas, Premier League proven. Guehi is a specific example because on top of that, he's 24 and has done really well for England. So there's other reasons why you can adjust that situation as well. Any more questions before I look to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes? There are still 30 people in the live, but it's dwindling a little bit. If you haven't already, please do like the stream. I'll keep saying it again. How would you sum up the difference in styles of football between the different top leagues around the world? Stereotypically, at least, and I'm not sure this is quite as defined as it used to be, but England was always fast and physical and powerful, and Spain was technical and more about passing and moving and skillful play. Italy was more, again, quite physical, and France has always been quite physical as well. But and Germany as well. I think actually there's lots more leagues in Europe are quite similar in terms of the style. In terms of Germany, France, you see a lot of players come from Germany and France and adjust quite well because it's all about pace and physicality. Whereas Italy is more about intelligence of defense, again, stereotypically and traditionally, and Spain's more about sort of being a bit more diminutive and a bit more about how technical about what you can do on the ball. And I think that's where the questions come from. But I would say it's less defined now than it used to be, because partly because there's lots more influx of players than there used to be as well. Um, so yeah, I think I don't have too many worries, particularly with the players on this list of them adjusting. And there's you've also got to look at the players themselves. So, like for example, um, Usman Diamonde is coming from Portugal. You might have concerns about Diamonde particularly adjusting himself to the league, but for me, he's 6'5". He's powerful. He's elegant. He's good on the ball, and he's got pace. So he's got everything you would need to adjust to the Premier League. Um, Whereas somebody who's maybe a little bit, if you're looking at a playmaker who's 5 foot, like someone's like lots of people say Kubo from Real Sociedad, that's not as obvious that he would just adapt to the Premier League as easily, because he's quite small, he's quite slight, and he's more about his speed and his technique. Obviously, I'm comparing defenders and playmakers there, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's not all about the. Lots of people look at the league that they're coming from and make a judgment. It's also about the style of player that you're getting, and someone like Diamonde is a great example of someone who could come in and who's ready for the Premier League. Jay says that's the next evolution of the game. Massive dudes with technical ability of little ones. Yeah, I think that's what Pep Guardiola and Barcelona and that Spain era did. Was it meant that everybody kind of had to learn how to be strong, how to be technical. Sorry. Cy Robson says, is Antonio Silva a pacey centre back? Not from what I've seen. This is where I think he's more technical and more good on the ball. He's good one-on-one, but I think Newcastle need a sort of. I think Newcastle needs to look at the physicality of a player in terms of their pace and their power, and that's why I've not suggest, because as I said on that list, if you look on the Monday show on the list of quality of those defenders, I would argue that Silva's probably top of the list, or at least second, maybe. But in terms of the right player for Newcastle at this period of time, I would probably argue not. What long-term effect will Piff's takeover of Vasco da Gama have? I can only imagine if it'll have similar impacts to Man City and Troyes, and Man City and Chelsea and Strasbourg, and Man City but actually less so, because less than that is probably more likely if players. There won't be a direct link. There'll be a sort of like there might be a few teams. You might have Vasco da Gama. A Vasco da Gama player comes through a player that the Piff goes to a club that Piff have bought in Europe, and then there's a hierarchy of these clubs that Chelsea and Man City have, where the best players that City are after. If City are going to buy a player, they'll tend to look at Troyes, or as they have done, Girona, as they did with Savinho, that sort of thing. So I would argue that the players that the direct link between Vasco da Gama and Newcastle, if there is one, would be that the best young players from Vasco da Gama would move up the ranks and eventually may join Newcastle if they're good enough. But I don't think there'd be much direct link between the two of them, if that makes sense. What was Brighton's secret sauce, and what evidence do we have that Ashworth brought it to NUFC? Logically, look as much as at play. I would say like Minter is a great example of exactly what Brighton did, isn't he? Like the fact that Brighton have gone for him says quite a lot. Like, it's about scouring markets that are untapped, and they've gone for the young lad from Argentina, the fullback Barco. He's a good player that other clubs have looked at, but they haven't struck for. They tend to go for those players, and those things take time. I would say that the growth of the women's team is more what Dan Ashworth was doing in terms, because again, in terms of recruitment, Ashworth. It was one of Ashworth's jobs, as opposed to Paul Mitchell, whose job is mainly to do with recruitment. So it's slightly different. It's comparing apples and oranges, really. And the growth of the women's team is more to do with what Ashworth was doing than say recruitment was. Whereas Paul Mitchell is going to be more about recruitment. So the recruitment side and seeing what Newcastle do recruitment wise will be more interesting when it comes to Paul Mitchell. Any theory on why we're holding back from training ground and stadium sponsor deals? Might be waiting to see the result of the City arbitration. Possibly, I don't really know. Honestly, it's puzzling that they haven't gone ahead and done that a little bit quicker. That's one of the criticisms that people have had of Newcastle in the last couple of years, is that they've not been active. And you've seen that City have got a new dairy partner and all that sort of thing. Newcastle haven't really been active with as much as that as people might want. So yeah. It looks like the live is dwindling a little bit, down to about 20 people. Brighton fans say Tony Bloom is his own software company and uses their own bespoke tool to find players from all the leagues linked with his gambling business. I did a piece on the Belgian club that Tony Bloom owns that a couple of years ago for BBC Sport. They played Liverpool in the Europa League, Union Saint-Gilloise, and the data, the level of data that they use, and in terms of signing players, it is quite impressive. And if Brighton are doing that on a bigger scale, then no wonder they find a lot of good players from different markets. But it also, on a smaller scale, of what someone, I think, was it Jay, whoever said that Brighton have a good sort of, they buy experienced players from the Premier League for cheap money. A slight sort of example of what Brighton were doing, of what Saint-Gilloise were doing, was they were going to buy, like Christian Burgess is somebody I spoke to, came into football late. He played for Middlesbrough, played for Portsmouth. He was going, he's nowhere near playing for a Champions League club, and then they bought him. I think he still plays for them now, and he's been playing in Europe for them. So that's kind of how they sort of blend players from different clubs and different cultures that you wouldn't imagine would make a good team. But if they fit on the data, then that's how they go for it, and more or less it works. Works more or less more of the time. So what is the unique selling point of the Premier League versus other leagues? High quality of all teams in the league versus a few, and the rest is weak. Yeah, marketing is a massive reason why the Premier League is, and obviously money as well. But marketing is why I think a lot of the idea that the Premier League has got the depth of quality that other leagues don't, and the fact that it's a great product and money, obviously, as Jay's pointed out. But marketing, it's the what for me makes the Premier League the best league in inverted commas is marketing over anything else. Tapsoba over Guehi, says Dave. I think, yeah, I would probably agree with that, but I'd be interested to see if that one will come off because of the situation with his contract and the fact that Leverkusen are in the Champions League. Let's see how that goes. But generally, I think Newcastle, you just have to give it the next 9 days. See where Newcastle are. I'll be back in September to maybe do a debrief of the transfer situation. I'm not back till the 10th, so it's probably a little bit late for that. But do continue to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks so much for joining me on this live stream. It's been great fun, as it always is. Really enjoy these. I'll be doing much more of them from September. As I say, like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll be back with the Thursday show tomorrow with a little bit of an overview of seeing where things are, maybe a little bit more detail on what Tapsoba would bring, what other players would bring, what the situation is in a newsworthy sense. And then, I'll also look ahead to the Bournemouth game, and then I'll take a break for a couple of weeks. I'll be back in September. Thanks so much for joining me. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.